Welcome. We have an action-packed newscast tonight for you. We're going to hop right into it. We have multiple field correspondents talking about a wide-ranging topics all about the First World War. We have a report file about the introduction of airplanes into the war. We have a correspondent finishing up their report on the study of the Battle of Passchendaele that recently concluded. We have breaking news about the United States entering the First World War. We are going to cut live to a correspondent on a German U-boat, and we have a final concluding report about the famous Sergeant Stubby. All this tonight and more on your 6 o'clock news. The air war during World War I saw an incredible rate of advancement during the 4 years of the course of the war. What we see is with the induction of the brand new technology of the airplane, by the end of the war, we see an incredible rate of transformation in the technology, the complexity, and the speed and maneuverability of all these different planes. For example, by 1914, just the entire world is a total of 1,000 planes in all of it. By 1918, France itself is making 1,000 airplanes a day. It sounds like we're about to take off into one of these, and we'll continue this journey in a second. What's important to understand is that the air war is brand spanking new. You have these 18, 19, 20-year-old pilots, many who have never even heard of an airplane before, put into these highly dangerous, highly maneuverable, highly fast-moving airplanes with lots of stress going around the world, right? With dogfights and other things, with very few months of training, maybe a month or two at most, and so you see an extraordinary rate of deaths and casualties flying around in these planes. It's estimated that over 50% of all the British pilots during the war died, and over 50,000 total pilots ended up dying at some point during the war. What we want to understand is that as a soldier on the ground, fighting in the muck and the dirt and the mud and the water and the rain, there is a certain romanticization and mythology associated with the air war. Because what we see is that these knights of the air, as they're called, can have the personal heroism of them in their cockpits be able to cause dramatic changes on the battlefront, whereas a soldier in the trenches had very little, if at all, effect from their point of view. And so there is a clear, powerful myth that evolves around these new type of excellent fighter pilots, the fighter ace. The fighter ace was even said to be a new physical type, thin, quick, showing controlled nervousness and alertness, an aristocratic bearing, and valuing fair play in combat. Aces were said to respect their enemies, throwing wreaths down to honor fallen foes. Fighter aces of the war include the American Eddie Rickenbacker, British aces Edward Manock and Alfred Ball, and the German Manfred von Richthofen, the infamous Red Baron, leader of the German Flying Circus, his own personal fighter wing. Richthofen scored the highest number of victories in the war, over 80 confirmed planes shot down, and was decorated Germany's highest medal. The aristocratic Richthofen was criticized, though, mainly because he, in order to increase the number of kills, he did not always seek about the best among his enemies, but instead looked for the most vulnerable and easily defeated enemy fighter pilots. Richthofen was the leader of his own fighter wing, and his instructional skills were such that many of his pupils would become fighter aces of their own. After Richthofen was killed in April of 1918, the last leader of his squad was Hermann Göring, later commander of the German Air Force in World War II. In 1917, at Passchendaele, no new strategy or weapon of any sort distinguished this attack. In the end, what separated Passchendaele from the great paroxysms of bloodshed that preceded it was one gruesome fact no one had planned for. In addition to falling victim to German fire, thousands of British soldiers nowhere near the sea drowned. The area around Ypres was covered by mist when the British infantry assault began in the early morning of July 31st, 1917. The mist soon turned into almost non-stop rain, the heaviest in 30 years. Weapons jammed, and the clay soil of the watery moonscape of craters became sticky. One officer likens its consistency to cheesecake, another to porridge. Guns could barely be moved, and mules and horses pulling ammunition wagons sank up to their stomachs and had to be dug out. Ambulances carried wounded soldiers skidded off the slippery roads. As summer turned to autumn, the men were reminded that the British soldiers' cold weather greatcoat was not waterproof. It absorbed mud and water like a relentless sponge, adding up to 34 pounds to its weight. As the battle continued, one single day saw 26,000 casualties in the mud. John Mortimer Wheeler, later a well-known archaeologist, wrote, "I cannot describe the conditions under which we are fighting. Anything I could write about them would seem an exaggeration, but would, in reality, be miles below the truth. The mud is not so much mud as a fathomless, sticky morass. The shell holes, where they do not actually merge into one another, are divided only by a few inches of this gluttonous mud. The gunners work thigh-deep in water. Some British artillery pieces dug themselves so deeply into the mud with their recoils that they dropped below the surface. The crew would put up a flag to mark the spot." Private Charlie Miles of the Royal Fusiliers carried messages as a runner, a misnomer in this season. The moment you set off felt that dreadful suction. In a way, it was worse when the mud didn't suck you down. Then you knew that it was a body you were treading on. It was terrifying. You tread on one on the stomach, perhaps, and would grunt all the air out. The smell could make you vomit. And when the shells landed, they blasted waterlogged, putrefying corpses into the air, showering pieces of them onto the soldiers who were still alive. Water filled some shell holes to a depth over a man's head, and troops joked that it was time to call in the Royal Navy. If a soldier with a heavy pack trudging around a crater slipped or stumbled, or jumped to avoid an incoming artillery round, the muddy water, often already fouled with the rotting bodies of men or horses, might claim it for good. Eddie Vaughn, a 19-year-old lieutenant, records, "From the darkness on all sides came the groans and wails of wounded men. Faint, long, sobbing moans of agony and despairing shrieks. Dozens of men with serious wounds must have crawled for safety into our new shell holes, and now the water was rising about them. We could do nothing to help them. Dunham was crying quietly beside me, and all the men were affected by the piteous cries. After hours of rain, the cries of the wounded had much diminished. The reason was only too apparent, for the water was right over the tops of the shell holes." End quote. Of the more than 88,000 British Empire casualties in the Ypres sector listed on memorials as missing, no one knows how many drowned. Belgian farmers' plows still uncovered their skeletons today. Haig finally called the halt to the fighting in Passchendaele in November of 1917 after his soldiers seized the last piece of ground less than 5 miles from where they had started in July. More than 15,000 Canadians were killed or wounded in the concluding spasm of combat to capture the village of Passchendaele, which had been scheduled to take on the 4th day of the offensive months before. It was such a patently meaningless sacrifice that, raging about it afterward at a meeting in London, Canadian Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden strode up to Lloyd George, seized his lapels, and shook him. In the mud of Passchendaele, however, falling dead from a bullet wound was only for the lucky. Quote, "A party of A Company men passing up to the front line found a man bogged to above the knees," remembered Major C.A. Bill of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. The united efforts of 4 of them, with rifles beneath his armpits, made not the slightest impression, and to dig, even if shovels had been available, would be impossible, for there was no foothold. Duty compelled them to move on up to the line, and when 2 days later they passed down that way, the wretched fellow was still there, but only his head was now visible, and he was raving mad. With overwhelming support, the United States Congress has voted on April 5th, 1917, to join the war against Germany, with only 6 U.S. senators and 50 U.S. representatives voting against the action. Now, since the beginning of the year, the United States and German relations have increasingly become more hostile. On January 31st, Johann von Bergstorff, the German ambassador at Washington, informed the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, that starting the next day, German submarines would sink on sight and without warning all merchant ships, including neutral vessels, bound for Britain or France. This saw then, in early February, the sinking of the Housatonic and in mid-March, the city of Memphis, Illinois, and other U.S. merchant ships. Wilson, over the course of this time, decided to sever diplomatic relations with Germany with this increasing overt hostility. In mid-February, the United States was warned by Great Britain about an ambassador from the German ambassador, from a telegram from the German ambassador Arthur Zimmermann. This was publicly released to newspapers and published for the American public to read that Zimmermann had sent a telegram to his ambassador in Mexico proposing Mexico to join the war on the side of the Germans in order to win back spoils of the American Southwest from the United States. This has further inflamed public opinion. Seeing no other option, on April 2nd, 1917, at 8:32 p.m., Wilson gave a war message to Congress calling for the body to declare war. Wilson said, quote, "The war would be a crusade for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and unite the world and make the world itself free." With Great Britain's increasing tightening of the noose of its blockade around Germany, Germany decided to unleash its weapons in response of its Unterseeboots, U-boats, or submarines. Germany was determined to starve the British Isles so completely that they would be able to counter the British blockade of Germany and force Great Britain to end the war. So from January to September of 1915, they unleashed unrestricted submarine warfare upon the high seas of the world's oceans. However, they are forced to stop shortly thereafter for several reasons. One, there is a very small tonnage sunk per U-boat lost. There was also an increasingly large international outcry against the campaign, peaking with the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915, which especially outraged the Americans. In 1916, following international law, the U-boats were only seeking 300,000 tons of shipping per month. That was nowhere near enough to affect the British war effort. So the Germans began a premeditated gamble in January of 1917. They would re-unleash their submarines in unrestricted submarine warfare by trying to attain a goal of sinking 600,000 tons of shipping per month, thinking that they could starve Great Britain faster than the Americans could help to arrive. And they are very successful in doing so. In the spring of 1917, Great Britain was left with only 1 month's grain reserves for its people. Thereupon, the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, insisted upon the convoy system. In the spaces of the high seas, a group of ships is a little more conspicuous than a single ship, and if not found by a U-boat, all would escape attack. Single ships sailing in succession one after another, however, presented the U-boat with a higher chance of making a sighting and so a sinking. The convoy system was progressively introduced for all oceanic sailings, and losses began to decline. A side effect of this was that in order to find more ships, the U-boats were drawn into coastal waters to hunt smaller, unescorted vessels, whereupon they were more easily found by air patrol, underwater listening devices, and depth charges, along with minefields to be able to claim victims. The submarines were unable to fulfill their promise and were not the dramatic swing in Germany's fortunes like they hoped. With the recent release of the new animated movie, Sergeant Stubby, An American Hero, the world is being reintroduced to one of the most famous dogs in all of American history. His incredible true story began that while training for combat on the fields of Yale University in 1917, Private J. Robert Conroy found a brindle puppy with a short tail. He named him Stubby, and soon the dog became the mascot of the 102nd Infantry 26th Yankee Division. He learned the bugle calls, the drills, and even a modified dog salute as he put his right paw on his right eyebrow when a salute was executed by his fellow soldiers. Stubby had a positive effect on morale and was allowed to remain in the camp even though animals were forbidden. When the division shipped out for France aboard the SS Minnesota, Private Conroy smuggled Stubby aboard. When the Yankee division headed for the front lines in France, Stubby was given special orders allowing him to accompany the division to the front lines as their official mascot. The 102nd Infantry reached the front lines on the 5th of February 1918. Stubby soon became accustomed to the loud rifles and heavy artillery fire. His first battle injury occurred from gas exposure. He was taken to a nearby field hospital and nursed back to health. The injury left him sensitive to the tiniest trace of gas. When the division was attacked in an early morning gas launch, most of the troops were asleep. Stubby recognized the gas and ran through the trench barking and biting at the soldiers, rousing them to sound the gas alarm, saving many from injury. Stubby also had a talent for locating wounded men between the trenches of the opposing armies. He would listen for the sound of English and then go to the location, barking until paramedics arrived or leading the lost soldiers back to the safety of the trenches. He even caught a German soldier mapping out the layout of the Allied trenches. The soldier called to Stubby, but he put his ears back and began to bark. As the German ran, Stubby bit him on the legs, causing the soldier to trip and fall. He continued to attack the man until the United States soldiers arrived. For capturing an enemy spy, Stubby was put in for promotion to the rank of sergeant by the commander of the 102nd Infantry. He became the first dog to be given the rank in the United States Armed Forces. Later, Stubby was injured during a grenade attack, receiving a large amount of shrapnel in his chest and leg. He was rushed to a field hospital and later transferred to a Red Cross recovery hospital for additional surgery. By the end of the war, Stubby had served in 17 battles. He led the American troops in a pass and review parade and later visited with President Woodrow Wilson. He visited the White House twice and met Presidents Harding and Coolidge. Stubby was awarded many medals for his heroism, including a medal from the Humane Society, which was presented by General John Pershing, the commanding general of the United States Armies. He was awarded a membership in the American Legion and the YMCA. When his master, J. Robert Conroy, began studying law at Georgetown University, Stubby became the mascot of the Georgetown Hoyas. He died in 1926, and his remains were donated to the Smithsonian and are on display for all to see.